London, 1827. Lady Ashley Whitford sat alone at the edge of the ballroom. Again. The crystal chandeliers of Almack's assembly rooms cast an unforgiving light upon the scene, illuminating every detail of her isolation. Her pale blue silk gown, with its delicate pearl embroidery and empire waistline, was perhaps the finest in her modest collection. Not that anyone noticed. For 3 seasons, she had become as much a fixture along the ballroom walls as the gilded sconces that flickered above her head, beautiful enough to draw a curious glance, yet somehow invisible when gentlemen sought partners for a dance. The ton had long ago decided her fate. Lady Ashley, the quiet one. Lady Ashley, the odd one. Lady Ashley, the one who would surely die a spinster beneath her mother's suffocating wing. The rumors her stepmother had carefully cultivated over the years had done their work well. Too bookish, too opinionated, too everything that a proper English rose should not be. How convenient for the Dowager Countess that her own daughters shined brighter in Ashley's dimmed light. The orchestra struck up another country dance. The vibrant melody twisted through the air like an invitation Ashley knew would never be extended to her. She watched as couples formed lines across the polished floor. Ladies' satin slippers gliding in perfect rhythm, gentlemen bowing with practiced grace. She allowed herself to imagine, for just a moment, what it might feel like to stand among them. To have a warm hand take hers and guide her through the steps she had practiced alone in her bedchamber countless times. But fantasies were dangerous things. They gave birth to hope, and hope was the cruelest deceiver of all. A slight commotion near the entrance caught her attention. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through summer wheat. He had arrived. The Duke of Ravenshire, Jorge Alexander Blackwood, the 7th Duke of Ravenshire, a man whose very name caused the marriage-minded mamas to nearly swoon with anticipation. A war hero returned from the peninsula with medals and mysteries in equal measure, wealthy beyond imagination, titled Beyond Reproach, and completely, utterly uninterested in society's games, or so they said. Ashley watched from her corner as he entered. Tall and broad-shouldered, his evening clothes impeccably tailored to disguise what rumors suggested were scars from battle. Dark hair swept back from a face that seemed carved from marble, handsome but severe, eyes that surveyed the room with the calculated assessment of a man who had seen battlefields and found drawing rooms equally treacherous. What secrets did he hide behind that stern expression? What wounds did his formal attire conceal? These were the thoughts that occupied Ashley's mind as the evening crawled forward. Thoughts of a man she would never speak to, at a ball where she would never dance, in a society that had already written the ending to her story. Until he looked at her. It happened in the space between heartbeats. His gaze, traveling around the perimeter of the room, found her in her quiet corner. And inexplicably, it stayed. Ashley felt the weight of his attention like physical touch. She looked down at her hands, certain he must be staring at someone nearby. When she dared glance up again, he was moving through the crowd, moving toward her. The gossips tracked his progress with hungry eyes. The Duke approaching the wallflower? Impossible. Unthinkable. Yet it was happening before the astonished eyes of London's elite. He stopped before her, tall and imposing, blocking out the light from the chandeliers above. For a moment he said nothing. Just studied her with eyes the color of a storm-tossed sea. Then he spoke the 3 words that would change everything. Dance with me. Not a question. Not quite a command. Something in between that left no room for refusal. Ashley's heart hammered against her ribs as she looked up at this man who had, with 3 simple words, rewritten every assumption she had made about this evening. About her life. What game was this? What cruel jest had her stepmother orchestrated now? But when she met his eyes, she saw no mockery there. No challenge. Only a strange, quiet intensity that seemed to recognize something in her that others had missed. Lady Ashley Whitford stood up from her chair, her legs trembling beneath layers of silk and modest petticoats. She placed her gloved hand in his outstretched palm, and the world began to turn again. Little did she know that this single dance would spiral into a romance that would scandalize, captivate, and ultimately transform London society. For neither the reserved wallflower nor the haunted Duke were exactly what they seemed, and the secrets they harbored were about to come to light. The morning after the Almack's ball, the drawing rooms of Mayfair buzzed with speculation. Had anyone seen how the Duke of Ravenshire had singled out that Whitford girl? The plain one, yes, the one whose stepmother was constantly apologizing for her lack of accomplishments. What could have possessed him? Some claimed it was pity. Others, more cynically inclined, suggested a wager among gentlemen. The most romantic souls whispered of love at first sight, though such notions were quickly dismissed with knowing laughter. None of these rumors reached Ashley as she sat in the morning room of Whitford House, attempting to focus on her embroidery while her mind rebelliously replayed every moment of the previous evening. His hand, warm even through their gloves. His voice, low and slightly rough, as if unused to polite conversation. The way he had led her through the dance with perfect precision, never once consulting the other dancers for his cues. And most of all, the conversation they had shared, so unlike the rehearsed pleasantries she had come to expect. "You're different from the others." He had said it without preamble as they circled each other in the figures of the dance. Ashley had nearly missed a step. "I assure you, Your Grace, I am exactly as unremarkable as everyone believes." His laugh had been unexpected, short and genuine. "No, Lady Ashley. You observe, you think, dangerous qualities in a ballroom." She had not known how to respond to such an assessment, delivered with neither compliment nor criticism, but as simple fact. Now, in the cold light of morning, Ashley wondered if she had imagined the entire exchange. Perhaps it had been some beautiful dream from which she had yet to fully awaken. The door to the morning room swung open with unnecessary force. Her stepmother, the Dowager Countess of Whitford, swept in with an expression that hovered between excitement and suspicion. "Ashley, there you are. I've been looking everywhere." Her stepmother's voice was pitched higher than usual, a clear sign she was agitated. "Is there something you neglected to tell me about last evening's entertainment?" Ashley looked up from her embroidery hoop, her needle poised mid-stitch. "I'm afraid I don't understand what you mean, stepmother." The Countess narrowed her eyes. "Do not play coy with me, girl. I have just received a morning call from Lady Jersey herself, who informed me that the Duke of Ravenshire danced with you." "The Duke, Ashley. The most eligible bachelor in England chose you for a country dance, and you did not think to mention this to me?" Ashley set down her needlework carefully. It seemed so inconsequential in the light of day. "It was a single dance, stepmother. Nothing more." "Nothing more?" The Countess paced the length of the Turkish carpet. "Do you have any idea what this could mean for our family? For your prospects?" "I believe it means that a gentleman was kind enough to ask a wallflower to dance," Ashley replied, her voice steady despite the flutter in her chest. "I wouldn't attach any particular significance to it." The Countess stopped her pacing to fix Ashley with a calculating look. "Your modesty does you credit, but we must be practical. This is an opportunity we cannot squander. The Duke has shown a preference for you, however momentary. We must capitalize on this interest before he reconsiders." A cold feeling settled in Ashley's stomach. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Her stepmother smiled, a sharp, triumphant expression that never reached her eyes. "You will join me for calls this afternoon. I believe Lady Bridgerton is hosting a small musical evening tomorrow. We shall ensure you have a new gown for the occasion. Something more striking than your usual choices." Ashley knew better than to argue directly, but there are no buts, my dear. The Countess's voice hardened. "You have been a burden on this household since your father's passing. 3 seasons without so much as a hint of a proposal. If the Duke has taken some interest in you, it is your duty to your family to encourage it." A familiar shame washed over Ashley. The reminder of her failure, of her dependence, was a weapon her stepmother wielded with expert precision. "Of course, stepmother. As you wish." "Excellent." The Countess moved to leave, then paused at the door. "And Ashley?" Try not to speak too much of your books or your peculiar ideas. Men of the Duke's stature expect a certain compliance in their companions. After her stepmother departed, Ashley remained motionless, her embroidery forgotten in her lap. The joy of the previous night's memory, tarnished now by the mercenary plans already taking shape around her. She had been a fool to think that one dance could change anything. A fool to imagine, even for a moment, that a man like the Duke of Ravenshire could see anything of value in her beyond the potential advantage of an alliance with her family. And yet, the memory of his words remained. You observe. You think. He had seen something in her that others had not. Or perhaps he had merely been polite to a lonely girl at a ball. Either way, Ashley knew better than to build castles from such insubstantial foundations. Little did she know that at that very moment, across Mayfair, the Duke of Ravenshire was penning a letter that would soon upend all her carefully managed expectations. The Duke of Ravenshire sat at his mahogany desk, morning light streaming through the tall windows of his study. His pen hovered above the cream-colored stationery, a rare indecision gripping him. Jorge Alexander Blackwood, decorated war hero and one of England's most powerful nobles, found himself stymied by the prospect of writing to a young woman he had met only once. He had faced Napoleon's armies with less trepidation. Around him, Ravenshire House stood quiet and dignified, its grandeur muted by the shrouded furniture and covered paintings that had remained untouched since his return from the peninsula. He had ordered the house maintained, but not truly lived in during his absence. Now that he had returned, he found little reason to change that arrangement. Until last night. Until he had seen her. Lady Ashley Whitford. Sitting alone and apart, yet somehow more present than anyone else in that glittering ballroom. Her eyes, intelligent, observant, had caught his attention immediately. While others preened and performed, she watched and understood. He had recognized a kindred spirit in her careful solitude. Their dance had confirmed his impression. Her conversation had been refreshingly direct, unburdened by the simpering flattery he had come to expect. And when she had looked at him, he'd had the unsettling feeling that she saw past the ducal title, past the medals, past the carefully constructed facade he presented to the world. She had seen him. Now he felt compelled to write to her, though such an action defied all propriety. An unmarried lady could not correspond with a gentleman unless they were engaged. But conventional rules had meant little to Jorge since he had watched his closest friends die on Spanish soil. He began to write. Lady Ashley, forgive the impropriety of this communication. Society would dictate that I call upon your mother to request permission to further our acquaintance through proper channels. I find, however, that I have little patience remaining for society's dictates. Our conversation, brief though it was, has remained in my thoughts. You spoke of books when others speak only of the weather. You asked of Spain's architecture when others inquire only after my title. I would continue our discussion, if you are willing. Enclosed you will find my personal copy of Wordsworth's poems, which touched on subjects we discussed during our dance. Should you wish to share your thoughts on the work, a note addressed to my secretary, Mr. Fletcher, will find its way to me discreetly. If you choose not to respond, I will understand and will trouble you no further. Respectfully, Ravenshire Jorge read over his words, aware of their potential to scandalize if discovered. A clandestine correspondence with an unmarried lady was precisely the sort of behavior that kept the gossip sheets in business. Yet he found himself unwilling to discard the letter. He had spent too many years watching men die to concern himself overly with the petty rules of the ton. Life was too brief, too fragile for such constraints. He sealed the letter, then summoned his most trusted servant. Fletcher, this is to be delivered to Lady Ashley Whitford, with discretion. The secretary, a slight man who had served the Duke since his university days, accepted the letter and the book without comment. Long experience had taught him when not to question his employer's commands. Yes, Your Grace. And should there be a reply? Bring it directly to me, no matter the hour. After Fletcher departed, Jorge moved to the window that overlooked the garden. Spring was beginning to assert itself, pale green buds appearing on branches that had stood bare through the London winter. He had not planned to participate in the season. Had, in fact, only attended Almack's at the insistence of his aunt, who had threatened to storm Ravenshire House if he continued his solitary existence. He had gone to silence her concerns, expecting nothing but tedium. Instead, he had found her, a quiet, thoughtful presence in a room full of noise. Jorge ran a finger along the scar that traced his jawline, usually hidden by careful grooming. The visible reminder of the many invisible wounds he carried, wounds that had driven him to avoid society, to retreat into the solitude of his position and privilege. Would Lady Ashley see those wounds too? Would she recoil from them, as others had? He thought of her eyes again, clear and perceptive, unafraid. For the first time since returning to England, the Duke of Ravenshire felt something stir within him that he had thought lost forever on the battlefields of Spain. Hope, dangerous, irrational hope. What he could not know was that his letter would arrive at precisely the moment when Lady Ashley would need it most. Ashley stood perfectly still as the modiste's assistant pinned yet another length of silk to the half-completed gown she wore. Her stepmother circled like a hawk, critiquing every detail. "The neckline must be lower, Madame Delacroix. We are not dressing a schoolgirl." "But, Madame," the assistant protested gently, "the current cut is most fashionable and perfectly proper for an unmarried lady." The Countess waved away the concern. "My stepdaughter has spent too long being proper and unremarkable. This gown must make an impression." Ashley kept her expression neutral, though humiliation burned beneath her skin. She felt like a prized mare being groomed for auction, her value determined solely by her potential to attract a wealthy buyer. The emerald silk her stepmother had selected was beautiful, she had to admit. The color brought out the gold flecks in her hazel eyes. But the cut her stepmother demanded was far more revealing than anything Ashley had worn before. Stepmother, perhaps something a bit more modest would be— "Modest?" The Countess laughed sharply. "Modesty has earned you 3 seasons without a proposal. The Duke of Ravenshire did not distinguish himself on the battlefield by being modest, nor did he amass his fortune through restraint. Men of his station expect a certain boldness, Ashley. It is time you learned that." The bell at the shop's entrance chimed, temporarily diverting the Countess's attention. Ashley took the moment to catch the modiste's eye and shake her head slightly. The Frenchwoman gave an almost imperceptible nod, understanding the silent request to ignore the Countess's more outrageous demands when completing the gown. It was a small rebellion, but Ashley had learned that small rebellions were often all that was available to a woman in her position. After what felt like hours, they finally departed the modiste's shop. Ashley's feet ached from standing, and her patience had worn dangerously thin. As they settled into their carriage for the journey home, her stepmother reviewed their schedule for the coming days with the precision of a general planning a military campaign. "We shall call on Lady Jersey this afternoon to thank her for her information regarding the Duke. Then tomorrow, the Bridgerton musical evening. I've heard the Duke is quite fond of music. You do still play the pianoforte adequately, don't you?" "Yes, stepmother." Ashley stared out the carriage window at the passing London streets, wondering how her life had become so thoroughly controlled by others, by expectations, by the desperate need to secure a match before she became truly unmarriageable. "Is that all you have to say?" The Countess fixed her with a sharp look. "This is the opportunity we have waited for. After your father's unfortunate investments, this family's future security rests entirely on making an advantageous match. If not for yourself, think of your younger sisters." The familiar weight of guilt settled on Ashley's shoulders. Her half-sisters, Sophia and Harriet, were still in the schoolroom, but in a few years, they too would enter society. Their prospects would be directly influenced by her success or failure. "I understand my duty," she said quietly. "I should hope so." The Countess turned her attention to her own reflection in the small mirror she carried, adjusting a stray lock of hair. "The Duke's interest may be fleeting. We must secure it while we can." They arrived home to find the house in an unusual state of activity. A footman hurried to open the carriage door, his expression betraying excitement poorly concealed beneath proper servile demeanor. "What is it, Thomas?" the Countess demanded as she stepped down. "A delivery for Lady Ashley, my lady, from Ravenshire House." Ashley froze on the carriage step, her heart suddenly pounding. The Countess whirled toward her, eyes wide with triumph. "What did I tell you?" she hissed, her voice low enough that only Ashley could hear. "Come, we must see what His Grace has sent. Flowers, perhaps, or an invitation to call." They hurried into the house, where upon a silver salver in the entrance hall rested a small package wrapped in fine paper and sealed with the Ravenshire crest. "Open it, Ashley." The Countess could barely contain her excitement. With trembling fingers, Ashley broke the seal and unwrapped the package. Inside was a leather-bound book of poetry, Wordsworth's latest collection, and a sealed letter bearing her name in a bold, masculine hand. Her stepmother reached for the letter. "I shall read it first, of course, to ensure it is appropriate." Ashley clutched the letter to her chest before she could stop herself, a protective instinct overwhelming propriety. "I believe a personal communication addressed to me is mine to read first, stepmother." The Countess's eyes narrowed dangerously. "You forget yourself, girl. Hand it over." For a moment, Ashley considered defiance. Then, remembering her sisters, her precarious position in the household, she reluctantly extended her hand to surrender the letter. At that precise moment, a commotion at the door saved her. "Lady Whitford! Sophia and Harriet have gotten into the fountain in the square again. They're soaked through, and Lady Harcourt is threatening to speak to the neighborhood committee." The Countess cursed under her breath. Not again. She glared at Ashley. "We will discuss this when I return. Do not think of breaking that seal before I have reviewed its contents." As her stepmother swept from the house, Ashley clutched the letter and book to her chest and raced upstairs to her bedchamber. She knew she had only minutes before the Countess returned. With shaking hands, she broke the seal on the letter, her eyes devouring the Duke's words. Each sentence felt like a revelation, so different from the formal pleasantries she had expected. He had remembered their conversation. He had thought of her afterward. He wished to correspond with her, secretly. It was improper, scandalous even. And yet, as Ashley traced her fingers over his signature, she felt something unfamiliar unfurl within her chest. Not just the fluttering attraction she had felt during their dance, but something deeper. Recognition. He had seen her, truly seen her, just as she had seen him. Quickly, before she could reconsider, Ashley moved to her writing desk and took out a sheet of paper. She would need to be careful, clever in how she responded. Her stepmother would be watching her closely now. But for the first time in years, Ashley felt a spark of something she had almost forgotten. Freedom. The freedom to be herself, to express her thoughts to someone who seemed genuinely interested in hearing them. Even if this correspondence led nowhere, even if the Duke's interest proved fleeting, this small act of independence felt precious beyond measure. She began to write, unaware that downstairs a pair of calculating eyes had watched her flight to her room with growing suspicion. Lady Bridgerton's musical evening was in full splendor, her home transformed into a showcase of refined entertainment. The drawing room glowed with the light of dozens of beeswax candles, their honey scent mingling with the perfume of spring flowers arranged in strategic locations throughout the space. At the pianoforte sat a young lady whose technical skill was unfortunately not matched by any discernible musical sensitivity. The audience maintained polite expressions while exchanging knowing glances behind raised fans. In the corner farthest from the music, the Duke of Ravenshire stood with his customary air of detachment. His presence at such an intimate gathering had caused quite a stir among the guests, particularly as he had attended few social events since his return to London. Jorge scanned the room, his expression betraying nothing of his inner thoughts. He had received Lady Ashley's reply to his letter that morning, a response so thoughtful and articulate it had confirmed his initial impression of her intelligence. Her observations on Wordsworth's use of natural imagery had been insightful, Her questions about his travels in Spain pointed and curious rather than merely polite. Now he found himself in the peculiar position of needing to maintain the appearance of casual acquaintance while carrying the secret knowledge of their correspondence. The door to the drawing room opened, and the butler announced the arrival of the Dowager Countess of Whitford and Lady Ashley Whitford. Jorge felt an unfamiliar tightening in his chest as Ashley entered the room. She wore a gown of deep emerald silk that brought a richness to her complexion he had not noticed in the harsh ballroom lighting. Her chestnut hair was arranged more elaborately than before, with small pearl pins catching the candlelight. She looked beautiful, yet somehow uncomfortable, as if the gown were not quite her own choice. Her eyes found his almost immediately, a flash of recognition passing between them before she quickly looked away, a becoming flush rising to her cheeks. The Countess, keen-eyed as a hunting falcon, noticed the exchange and steered her stepdaughter directly toward him. "Your Grace," the Countess gushed, dipping into a deep curtsy. "What a pleasure to see you again so soon. You remember my stepdaughter, Lady Ashley?" Jorge bowed formally. "Lady Whitford. Lady Ashley. The pleasure is mine." Ashley curtsied, her eyes downcast in proper modesty, though Jorge caught the slightest quirk at the corner of her mouth, amusement at the formality of their greeting when they had shared such personal thoughts on paper mere hours ago. "We were so honored by your thoughtful gift, Your Grace," the Countess continued. "The poetry was most elegantly bound. Ashley has scarcely put it down since its arrival." Jorge noted the slight stiffening of Ashley's shoulders. "I'm gratified to hear it brought pleasure," he replied carefully. Lady Ashley's observations during our dance revealed a keen literary mind. I thought the volume might be of interest. Ashley's eyes met his briefly, gratitude evident in their depths. "It was most thoughtful, Your Grace. Wordsworth's reflections on nature's capacity to elevate the human spirit have been particularly meaningful." The Countess looked momentarily taken aback by Ashley's articulate response, then quickly recovered. "My stepdaughter has always been bookish to a fault. I continually remind her that a lady's accomplishments should extend beyond solitary reading. I find that a woman who reads possesses a universe within herself," Jorge replied, his tone cooler than before. "Surely that is an accomplishment worth cultivating." Before the Countess could respond to this gentle rebuke, Lady Bridgerton approached their group. "Duke, I wonder if I might persuade Lady Ashley to favor us with a performance. I've heard she plays quite beautifully." Jorge watched as Ashley's expression flickered between panic and resignation. He suspected she had hoped to avoid such public display. "Oh, yes," the Countess interjected eagerly. "Ashley would be delighted. Wouldn't you, dear?" Without waiting for her stepdaughter's response, the Countess began guiding conversations toward the pianoforte, effectively maneuvering Ashley into a position where refusal would appear ungracious. Jorge stepped forward. "If I might be permitted to turn the pages for Lady Ashley? I've some small experience with music." The offer, unexpected from a duke to an unmarried lady of no particular consequence, caused a momentary hush in conversations nearby. Lady Bridgerton recovered first, beaming with delight at this development that would certainly feature prominently in tomorrow's gossip. "How kind of you, Your Grace." As they moved toward the instrument, Jorge leaned slightly toward Ashley, keeping his voice low. "Forgive me if I've overstepped. I thought you might welcome a friendly presence." Ashley's answering smile was small but genuine. "Thank you. Though I warn you, my skills are modest at best." "I doubt that very much," Jorge replied, surprising himself with the warmth in his voice. Ashley took her seat at the pianoforte, arranging her skirts with practiced movements that betrayed years of lessons in deportment. Jorge positioned himself beside her, maintaining a proper distance while still close enough to assist with the music. For a moment, she stared at the keys, her hands hovering uncertainly. Then, with a small breath that only Jorge was positioned to notice, she began to play. The piece she chose was not the showy, technically difficult selection her stepmother clearly would have preferred. Instead, she played a simple Mozart sonata, rendered with such genuine feeling that the drawing room gradually fell silent. Jorge watched her hands move across the keys, graceful and confident in a way she rarely seemed in conversation. Her face transformed as she played, the careful mask of propriety giving way to genuine expression. He found himself captivated not by technical brilliance, but by the honest emotion she conveyed through the music. When she finished, there was a moment of appreciative silence before polite applause filled the room. Ashley looked up at Jorge, a question in her eyes. "Beautiful," he said simply, meaning far more than the performance. A voice cut through the moment. "Well done, Ashley, though perhaps something more challenging next time." The Countess had materialized beside them, clearly displeased that her stepdaughter had not chosen a more impressive piece. "I thought it was perfectly chosen," Jorge countered smoothly. "Technical skill without feeling is merely mechanical. Lady Ashley plays with the heart, which is far rarer." The Countess's smile tightened. "How perceptive of you, Your Grace." "Ashley, Lady Bridgerton has asked if you might join the young ladies in the small parlor for refreshments. Run along, dear." The dismissal was thinly veiled, and Jorge knew immediately that the Countess wished for private conversation with him. Ashley recognized it too, her eyes briefly meeting his with an apologetic glance before she obediently withdrew. Once she had gone, the Countess's manner shifted subtly, becoming more direct. "You are very kind to show such attention to my stepdaughter, Your Grace. She is not accustomed to being singled out in society." "Lady Ashley strikes me as someone who deserves more attention than she receives," Jorge replied neutrally. The Countess studied him with calculated assessment. "Forgive my directness, Duke, but a man in your position must be accustomed to misinterpretation of your intentions. Ashley is a sensitive girl, easily influenced by kindness." Jorge understood the implication immediately. The Countess was simultaneously warning him against trifling with her stepdaughter, while also hinting that a serious suit would be most welcome. "I assure you, Lady Whitford, I do nothing without purpose." The Countess's smile widened, taking his deliberately ambiguous response as encouragement. "Then, perhaps you would honor us by calling at Whitford House tomorrow. We receive visitors between 2 and 4. Jorge inclined his head slightly. "I shall endeavor to call if my schedule permits." Satisfied with this small victory, the Countess moved away to circulate among other guests. Jorge remained by the pianoforte, his thoughts troubled by the exchange. He had entered into correspondence with Lady Ashley on impulse, drawn by her intelligence and the genuine connection he had sensed during their dance. Now he found himself navigating the treacherous waters of society's expectations, where every interaction was scrutinized for potential advantage. The Countess clearly viewed him as a prize to be captured for her stepdaughter, or rather, for the financial security such a match would bring to their family. It was a familiar position for a wealthy duke, yet it left a bitter taste. Did Ashley share her stepmother's mercenary view? He thought not, based on the sincerity of her letter and the unguarded moment they had just shared through music. But appearances could be deceiving, as he knew all too well. Jorge moved toward the garden doors, needing a moment of fresh air away from the stifling politeness of the gathering. As he stepped onto the terrace, he caught a glimpse of a familiar emerald gown at the far end of the garden path. Ashley stood alone, her face tilted up toward the night sky, seemingly oblivious to the chill in the spring air. The sight of her, momentarily free from society's watchful gaze, made his decision for him. Perhaps it was time to discover who Lady Ashley Whitford truly was, beyond the careful letters and brief public encounters. And perhaps, in the process, he might rediscover something of himself that he had thought lost forever on distant battlefields. With purposeful strides, Jorge descended the terrace steps and moved along the gravel path toward the solitary figure beneath the stars. Chapter 6. Ashley had escaped to the garden the moment propriety allowed, desperate for fresh air and solitude after the stifling atmosphere of the music room. Her performance at the pianoforte had left her strangely vulnerable, aware of the Duke's presence beside her, of his eyes observing her with an intensity that both unsettled and exhilarated her. Now she stood beneath the vast canopy of stars, breathing deeply of the night air scented with early roses and damp earth. In the distance, the music and conversation from the house created a gentle backdrop to her thoughts. She had not expected him to defend her to her stepmother. The memory of his words, "I find that a woman who reads possesses a universe within herself," warmed her more effectively than any shawl against the evening chill. Their correspondence, brief though it had been, had awakened something in her that she had carefully suppressed through years of disappointment. A sense of possibility, of being valued for her mind rather than merely assessed for her marital potential. Yet caution tempered her hope. The Duke of Ravenshire was one of England's most eligible bachelors. His attention, however genuine it might seem, had already set the tongues of the tongue wagging. Her stepmother's barely concealed ambition to secure him as a son-in-law would only intensify the scrutiny. The crunch of gravel underfoot alerted her to another's presence in the garden. Ashley turned, expecting to find a servant sent to retrieve her, or perhaps another guest seeking temporary escape from the gathering. Instead, she found herself face to face with the Duke himself. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a quick curtsy. "I did not expect to find anyone else out here." Jorge moved to stand beside her, maintaining a respectful distance that nevertheless felt intimate in the moonlit garden. "Nor I you, Lady Ashley, though I confess I am glad of the coincidence." Ashley's heart quickened at his words, at the way his formal address softened when he spoke her name. "We should return to the house. People will talk. People always talk." His voice carried a hint of weariness. "It's the primary occupation of London society." This startled a small laugh from her. "And here I thought their primary occupation was matchmaking." "Ah, but matchmaking is merely the highest form of gossip." A corner of his mouth lifted in a half-smile that transformed his serious features. "Your stepmother excels at both, I notice." Heat rushed to Ashley's cheeks, embarrassment and mortification mingling. "She is determined to see my sisters and me well settled. At any cost to your happiness, it seems." Ashley glanced at him sharply, surprised by his perceptiveness. "My happiness is secondary to family duty, Your Grace. Surely a duke understands that better than most." He turned to face her fully then, his expression grave in the moonlight. "I understand duty, Lady Ashley. I've seen men die for it, but I've also seen men live hollow lives in its name, sacrificing everything meaningful for the sake of obligation." The raw honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She had sensed shadows in him during their dance, glimpsed them in his letter, but this direct reference to his wartime experiences felt like a confidence she had done nothing to earn. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That was presumptuous of me." "No." Jorge shook his head. "You were honest. I value that more than you know." A comfortable silence fell between them, both gazing upward at the star-filled sky. Ashley found herself acutely aware of his presence beside her, the subtle scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to his evening clothes, the solid strength he radiated even in stillness. "I received your letter," she said finally, keeping her voice low. "It was unexpected." "Too forward?" "No." She smiled into the darkness. "Too interesting. Your observations on Wordsworth's treatment of memory particularly resonated with me." Jorge turned toward her, surprise evident in his expression. Most ladies would have mentioned the impropriety of such a correspondence first. "I'm not most ladies, Your Grace." "No," he agreed, his voice warming. "You most certainly are not." Ashley hesitated, then ventured further. "May I ask you something rather direct?" After my own directness, I could hardly object. "Why me?" She gestured vaguely at herself. 3 seasons without a single serious suitor suggests I am not considered a prize by society's standards. You could dance with anyone, correspond with anyone, yet you chose to single out perhaps the least remarkable young lady in London." The moment the words left her lips, Ashley regretted them. They revealed too much of her insecurity, her wounded pride. She half expected him to offer polite platitudes or, worse, pity. Instead, he looked at her with an intensity that seemed to see through all her carefully constructed defenses. "Remarkable is precisely what you are, Lady Ashley. In a room full of women trained to be identical, to laugh at the same jokes, admire the same music, express the same opinions, you retain your own mind, your own perspective." Jorge's voice was low, fervent. "Do you have any idea how rare that is?" Ashley found herself without words. a most unusual circumstance for a woman who lived much of her life in books. "Forgive me," he continued, mistaking her silence for discomfort. "I speak too plainly. The war perhaps damaged my capacity for social niceties." "No." Ashley found her voice again. "Please don't apologize for honesty. It's just that no one has ever seen me that way before." The moon emerged from behind a cloud, bathing the garden in silver light. In its glow, Ashley could see the Duke's face clearly, the strong line of his jaw, the scar that traced its edge, the intensity in his storm-gray eyes. Without thinking, she reached up to touch the scar, stopping just short of contact as propriety reasserted itself. "I'm sorry, that was—" Jorge caught her hand in his own, gently, giving her every opportunity to withdraw. But instead of pulling away, he guided her fingers to the mark on his face. "A French cavalry saber," he said quietly. "The least of my scars, but the most visible." Ashley felt the raised line beneath her fingertips, her heart pounding at the intimacy of the touch, at the trust implicit in the gesture. "And the others?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Some are on my body." Jorge's eyes held hers. "Others are not so easily seen." In the house, the music changed tempo, a lively country dance replacing the more sedate minuet. The sound seemed to break the spell between them. Jorge released her hand, stepping back slightly. "We should return," he said, his voice regaining its formal edge. "Your stepmother will be looking for you, and a prolonged absence from the gathering would be noted." "Of course." Ashley smoothed her skirts, reality reasserting itself with cold clarity. The magical interlude in the garden could not last. Tomorrow, they would once again be the Duke and the wallflower, separated by society's rigid structures. Jorge offered his arm. "Shall we?" She placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, keenly aware of the solid strength beneath the fine wool of his evening coat. As they walked back toward the house, Ashley gathered her courage for one last question. "Will you write to me again?" she asked, keeping her eyes fixed on the path ahead. His answer was immediate, certain. "Yes, if you wish it. I do." They had reached the terrace steps. Before they could ascend, Jorge stopped, turning to face her one last time before they re-entered society's watchful domain. "Lady Ashley, I must tell you that I am not the man most believe me to be. The war changed me in ways I am still discovering. I am not the carefree young nobleman who left England years ago." Ashley studied his face, the gravity in his expression, the hint of vulnerability beneath his carefully maintained control. "Good," she said simply. "Because I am not the biddable society miss most believe me to be either." For a moment, genuine surprise flickered across his features. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. A full, unguarded smile that transformed his entire countenance and sent Ashley's heart into an unladylike flutter. "Then perhaps, Lady Ashley, we shall discover who we truly are together." As they rejoined the gathering, resuming their proper roles and distances, Ashley felt the weight of the Duke's words settle around her like a promise. A dangerous promise, perhaps, but one she found herself increasingly willing to risk everything to explore. The drawing room of Whitford House had been prepared with unusual care. Fresh flowers from the hothouse adorned every available surface, their heavy perfume mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and furniture polish. The best tea service gleamed on the side table, and the Countess had instructed the cook to prepare an array of delicacies worthy of a royal visit. All for the anticipated call from the Duke of Ravenshire. Ashley sat stiffly on the edge of the settee, her new emerald gown, altered by the modiste to a slightly more modest neckline than her stepmother had demanded, making her uncomfortably aware of every breath she took. The Countess paced by the window, periodically peering out at the street below for any sign of a ducal carriage. "Perhaps he won't come," Ashley ventured, partly to break the tense silence, and partly to prepare her stepmother for disappointment. The Countess shot her a sharp look. "Of course he will come. He all but promised to call today." "He said he would endeavor to call if his schedule permitted," Ashley corrected gently. "A duke must have many demands on his time. Don't be naive, Ashley." The Countess resumed her pacing. When a man of his standing shows interest in a young lady, particularly one with... Her gaze swept over Ashley with barely concealed criticism. Well, one who has not previously attracted much attention, his intentions must be serious indeed. Ashley bit back a retort, knowing it would only fuel her stepmother's antagonism. Instead, she reached for the book of poetry the Duke had sent her, which she had taken to carrying with her as a small act of defiance. Before she could open it, the Countess swooped down and plucked it from her hands. For heaven's sake, put this away. A man does not call to see a woman read. He might, if the woman's thoughts on what she reads interest him, Ashley replied, unable to completely suppress her frustration. The Countess narrowed her eyes. I have indulged your peculiar interests for too long, it seems. Men, particularly men of the Duke's standing, seek certain qualities in a wife. Beauty, of course. Proper breeding and connections. The ability to manage a household and provide heirs. They do not seek bluestockings who will challenge them at every turn. Ashley felt the familiar weight of inadequacy settle over her. Perhaps you're right. In which case, the Duke's interest is indeed puzzling. Before her stepmother could respond, the butler appeared at the drawing-room door. His Grace, the Duke of Ravensshire, he announced with the appropriate gravity such a visitor warranted. Jorge entered the room with the confident bearing of a man accustomed to commanding attention. He was dressed more casually than Ashley had seen him before, his coat of dark blue superfine cut perfectly to his broad shoulders, his cravat arranged in a simple yet elegant style. He looked less the formal aristocrat and more the gentleman at ease. Ashley rose along with her stepmother, dropping into the curtsy that propriety demanded. Yet when she dared glance up, she found the Duke's eyes already on her, warm with a private recognition that sent her pulse racing. Your Grace, how kind of you to call, the Countess gushed, gesturing toward the most comfortable chair in the room. We are so honored by your visit. Jorge bowed to both women, his manner properly formal, yet somehow conveying a particular attention to Ashley. The honor is mine, Lady Whitford. I trust I find you both well? Quite well, thank you, the Countess replied, signaling to the maid to pour tea. Ashley, do sit closer so that the Duke need not strain to converse with you. With reluctance, Ashley moved to the chair her stepmother indicated, feeling like a chess piece being strategically positioned. Jorge accepted a cup of tea, his expression revealing nothing of his thoughts as the Countess launched into what was clearly a prepared speech highlighting her stepdaughter's accomplishments. Ashley plays the pianoforte beautifully, as you witnessed last evening, and is quite accomplished at watercolors. Her French is impeccable. Her father spared no expense on her education before his untimely passing. Lady Ashley's education speaks for itself in her conversation. Jorge interjected smoothly. I found her observations on Wordsworth's poetry most insightful. The Countess's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Yes, Ashley has always been fond of reading, a useful pastime for a young lady in moderation. Ashley stared into her teacup, mortification warming her cheeks. She felt like a prize mare being paraded before a potential buyer, her good points emphasized, her flaws carefully minimized. Jorge set down his cup with deliberate care. Actually, Lady Whitford, I was hoping to speak with Lady Ashley about the book I sent her. Perhaps we might walk in the garden. With your permission, of course. The garden? The Countess looked momentarily taken aback by this breach of standard calling etiquette. But her desire to please the Duke quickly overcame her adherence to propriety. Of course, though it is hardly at its best this early in the season. I shall accompany you. That won't be necessary, I assure you, Jorge cut in, his tone courteous but firm. We shall remain within sight of the house at all times. The Countess hesitated, clearly torn between the impropriety of allowing her unmarried stepdaughter to walk alone with a gentleman and the desire to accommodate the wishes of such an eligible suitor. Well, I suppose, if you remain on the main paths where the servants can see you from the windows. Ashley could scarcely believe her stepmother's acquiescence. The Countess, who scrutinized her every movement and controlled her every social interaction, was willing to bend the rules of propriety for the sake of the Duke's title and fortune. Jorge turned to Ashley, offering his arm. "Shall we, Lady Ashley?" She placed her hand lightly on his sleeve, keenly aware of her stepmother's calculating gaze following them as they made their way through the French doors and into the small but well-maintained town garden. Once outside, Jorge exhaled audibly, some of the formal stiffness leaving his posture. "Your stepmother is rather determined." Ashley couldn't help the small laugh that escaped her. "That is perhaps the most diplomatic description of her I've ever heard." They walked in companionable silence for a moment, following the neat gravel path that circled a central fountain, currently dry for the season. The garden was indeed not at its best, with many of the flowering shrubs still dormant and the perennial beds showing only the earliest green shoots. "I must apologize for her behavior," Ashley said finally. "She means well, but—" "You needn't apologize for her," Jorge interrupted gently. "I've navigated the marriage mart long enough to recognize an ambitious mama, or stepmother, in this case." Ashley sighed, stopping beside a stone bench positioned to catch the afternoon sun. "That's all I am to her, a commodity to be marketed and sold to the highest bidder. It's my duty to make a good match, to secure my sister's futures." Jorge studied her face, the sunlight illuminating the golden flecks in her hazel eyes. "And what do you want, Lady Ashley, beyond what duty dictates?" The directness of the question startled her. No one had asked for her own desires in so long that she struggled to articulate them. "I want—" she began hesitantly, then found her voice growing stronger. "I want to be valued for my mind, not just as a decorative accessory or a means to continue a bloodline. I want conversation that challenges me, that makes me think. I want to see more of the world than just London ballrooms and country estates." She stopped abruptly, embarrassed by the passion that had crept into her voice. These were not the demure aspirations of a proper English rose. But Jorge was nodding, his expression thoughtful, rather than shocked. "Spain changed me," he said after a moment. "I went to war a privileged young nobleman who had never questioned his place in the world. I returned different." Ashley waited, sensing he had more to say. "When I see the endless rounds of balls and dinner parties, the calculated matchmaking, the concern over who wore what gown or which gentleman danced with which lady—" Jorge shook his head. "It all seems so trivial after watching good men die in muddy fields far from home." "I can't imagine what you've seen," Ashley said softly. "But I understand feeling out of place in a world that seems determined to value all the wrong things." Jorge smiled then, a genuine expression that reached his eyes and softened the habitual seriousness of his features. "That's why I noticed you, Lady Ashley. In a room full of people playing their assigned roles perfectly, you were the only one who seemed to be thinking your own thoughts." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small, folded note. "Another breach of propriety, I'm afraid. But after our correspondence, I find I'm increasingly impatient with society's constraints." Ashley accepted the note, carefully tucking it into her sleeve without reading it. "My stepmother would have apoplexy if she knew we were exchanging private communications. Then we shall have to be discreet." Jorge's voice held a note of conspiracy that made Ashley feel, for the first time in years, like a participant in her own life, rather than merely a pawn in others' games. A movement at the drawing-room window caught her attention, her stepmother, watching them with barely concealed anticipation. "We should return," she said reluctantly, "before she sends a footman to escort us back." Jorge followed her gaze and nodded, offering his arm once more. "May I ask you something first, Lady Ashley?" "Of course. Would you permit me to call you Ashley, when we are not in company?" The request, so simple yet so intimate, made her breath catch. "We barely know each other, Your Grace." "Jorge," he corrected. "And I believe we know each other better than many who have been acquainted for years. Our letters have revealed more truth than most drawing-room conversations." Ashley considered this, then nodded slowly. "Very well, Jorge, though only when we are alone." His smile was worth the small impropriety. "Thank you, Ashley." As they walked back toward the house, Ashley was acutely conscious of the note hidden in her sleeve, of the warmth of Jorge's arm beneath her hand, of the strange new possibility unfolding between them. A possibility that transcended her stepmother's mercenary ambitions and society's rigid expectations. For the first time since her father's death had left her at the mercy of her stepmother's calculations, Ashley felt something dangerous and exhilarating begin to grow within her heart. Hope. The weeks that followed transformed London's social season for both Ashley and Jorge in ways neither could have anticipated. On the surface, nothing appeared unusual. The Duke of Ravenshire continued to attend select social functions, still maintained his reputation as a serious, somewhat aloof figure. Lady Ashley Whitford continued to accompany her stepmother to balls and dinner parties, still sat more often than she danced. But beneath this placid exterior, a clandestine relationship flourished through notes passed by trusted servants, brief conversations in crowded ballrooms, and the occasional stolen moment in gardens or library alcoves. Jorge's note that day in her garden had contained a proposal, not of marriage, but of friendship. A request that they continue to know each other away from society's watchful eyes, through letters and conversation, unconstrained by the artificial limitations of proper acquaintance. Ashley had accepted with an eagerness that might have shocked her had she stopped to consider it. But something about the Duke, about Jorge as she now thought of him, made conventional caution seem less important than the connection they were forming. Their correspondence became her secret joy. Each letter revealed more of the man behind the ducal title, his dry wit, his thoughtfulness, the lingering shadows from his war experiences that sometimes darkened his perspective. In turn, she shared her own thoughts more freely than she had ever dared with another person, trusting him with opinions and dreams she had previously confined to her private journal. The Countess, of course, remained blissfully unaware of these exchanges, though she was delighted by the Duke's continued attention to her stepdaughter at social events. She attributed his interest entirely to her own clever maneuvering and Ashley's improved appearance, never suspecting the intellectual and emotional connection developing beyond her scrutiny. It was at Lady Danbury's midsummer ball, nearly a month after their first dance, that everything changed. The evening had begun like any other. Ashley wore a new gown of pale blue silk, her chestnut hair arranged with pearl pins that Jorge had sent as a small token of esteem, ostensibly for her birthday, but in reality, a response to her mention in a letter that she loved the ocean but had seen it only once as a child. "They've always reminded me of sea foam on waves," he had written. "Perhaps someday you'll see the Mediterranean as I did. Its waters so blue they seem unreal." The pearls had arrived the next day, accompanied by a formal note that even her stepmother could not find objectionable. The Countess had been ecstatic, declaring it a clear sign of serious intentions. Now, as Ashley entered Lady Danbury's ballroom, her eyes immediately sought Jorge among the crowd. She found him in conversation with several gentlemen near the card-room entrance, his tall figure unmistakable even from a distance. As if sensing her presence, he looked up, their eyes meeting across the crowded room. The smile that briefly crossed his face, visible only to her, sent warmth spreading through her chest. It was their private language now, these looks exchanged across ballrooms, these small gestures that carried meaning only they understood. "Your Duke is in attendance, I see," her stepmother murmured beside her, satisfaction evident in her voice. "We must make sure you stand up with him for at least one dance." "He's not my Duke, stepmother," Ashley replied automatically, though the words felt increasingly hollow. "Not yet, perhaps, but I've observed his attentions these past weeks. They have been most particular, despite his reputation for avoiding entanglements." Ashley said nothing, uncomfortable with her stepmother's mercenary assessment, yet unable to deny that Jorge's attentions had indeed been focused almost exclusively on her. What the Countess didn't know was the depth of those attentions, the letters, the conversations about literature and philosophy, the gradual revealing of their true selves to each other. They made their way through the room, greeting acquaintances with practiced politeness. Ashley was aware of more eyes on her than usual, of whispers behind fans as she passed. Her association with the Duke had elevated her status in society, transforming her from overlooked wallflower to object of fascination and, in some quarters, envy. "Lady Ashley, such a charming gown," Lady Jersey commented as they stopped to exchange pleasantries. "The color suits you admirably. Doesn't it, Duke?" Ashley turned to find Jorge had approached their group, his formal evening attire emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the lean strength of his frame. "Indeed it does," he agreed, his eyes meeting hers with warmth before he bowed to the ladies present. "Good evening, Lady Whitford." "Lady Ashley." "Your Grace," the Countess responded, practically glowing with satisfaction at his immediate approach. "We were just remarking on the excellence of Lady Danbury's arrangements this evening." Jorge made the appropriate response, maintaining all the expected social niceties while somehow conveying to Ashley, through the slightest quirk of his eyebrow, his amusement at the predictable conversation. As the orchestra began tuning their instruments for the first dance, Jorge turned to Ashley. "Might I claim the first dance, Lady Ashley?" Before Ashley could respond, a commotion at the ballroom entrance drew everyone's attention. A woman's voice, slightly too loud, and with an accent that immediately marked her as foreign, cut through the genteel murmur of conversation. "Where is he? Where is my dear Jorge?" Ashley watched as all color drained from Jorge's face. He turned toward the voice, his expression shifting from shock to something close to horror. At the entrance stood a strikingly beautiful woman with raven black hair and olive skin. Her gown, though elegant, was cut in a continental style that showed more décolletage than was considered proper in English society. Diamonds glittered at her throat and ears, catching the light from the chandeliers above. Beside her, a footman looked distinctly uncomfortable as he attempted to collect her invitation card. "The Countess of Ravenshire requires no invitation," the woman declared imperiously. "My husband's name is sufficient." A collective gasp rippled through the nearby guests. Ashley felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her feet. The Countess of Ravenshire? Jorge's wife? She looked at him, silently pleading for some explanation, some denial of what she was hearing. But his face had become an unreadable mask. The warmth that had been there moments ago completely vanished. "Excuse me, ladies," he said stiffly. "I must attend to this situation." Without meeting Ashley's eyes again, he strode toward the entrance, his posture rigid with barely contained tension. The Countess clutched Ashley's arm painfully. "Did she say husband? The Duke is married?" Around them, the whispers had already begun, spreading through the ballroom, with the speed that only truly scandalous gossip could achieve. "I had heard rumors of a Spanish wife, but they were never confirmed," Lady Jersey murmured, her eyes alight with the thrill of fresh scandal. How extraordinary. Ashley stood frozen, unable to process what was happening. In all their letters, all their conversations, Jorge had never mentioned a wife. Not once had he even hinted at such a significant detail of his life. The omission was so enormous, so fundamental, that it cast every interaction they had shared into doubt. She watched as Jorge reached the dark-haired woman, speaking to her in rapid, low tones. The woman laughed, a rich, melodious sound that carried across the now hushed ballroom, then placed her hand possessively on his arm. "We should leave," Ashley said quietly to her stepmother. "Now." "Leave?" The Countess looked at her as if she had lost her mind. "This is the most interesting development of the season. We must stay and observe." "No." Ashley's voice was firmer than she had ever used with her stepmother. "I wish to leave immediately. If you won't accompany me, I shall call for the carriage myself." Something in her expression must have conveyed her distress, for the Countess's protest died on her lips. "Very well," she conceded reluctantly. "Though this is most irregular." As they moved toward the exit, Ashley kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to look again at Jorge and the woman claiming to be his wife. Her mind raced with questions, with hurt, with a sense of betrayal so acute it was physically painful. They had nearly reached the door when she heard his voice behind her. "Ashley, wait, please." She stopped, unable to ignore him despite every instinct screaming at her to flee. Turning slowly, she found Jorge standing a few feet away, his expression a complex mixture of regret and desperation. "Your wife awaits you, Your Grace," she said, proud of how steady she kept her voice despite the turmoil within. "It would be improper to keep her waiting." "It's not what you think," he began. "I can explain." "I think it's exactly what it appears to be," Ashley cut him off, aware of the curious eyes and ears around them. "You have been less than forthcoming about your marital status. A rather significant omission, wouldn't you agree?" Jorge looked stricken, but before he could respond, the dark-haired woman appeared at his side, slipping her arm through his with practiced familiarity. "Introduce me to your little friend, Jorge," she purred, her accent lending an exotic quality to her English. "This is Lady Ashley Whitford," Jorge said stiffly. "Lady Ashley, may I present Doña Isabella Navarro?" "His wife," the woman added with a smile that held no warmth, though that detail seems to have escaped his memory of late. Ashley curtsied formally, feeling as though she were moving through a nightmare. "Countess," she acknowledged, her throat tight with unshed tears. "If you'll excuse me, my stepmother and I were just leaving." "So soon?" Isabella's dark eyes glittered with malicious amusement. "But I've only just arrived, and I have so many stories to share about my dear husband's adventures in Spain." "Another time, perhaps," Ashley managed, before turning away, unable to bear another moment of this public humiliation. As she and the Countess departed, the buzz of conversation rose behind them, the ton already dissecting every detail of the scandalous scene they had just witnessed. Ashley moved mechanically, focusing only on maintaining her composure until she reached the safety of their carriage. Once inside, away from prying eyes, she allowed a single tear to escape, quickly brushing it away before her stepmother could notice. "Well," the Countess said after a moment of tense silence, "it seems we have had a narrow escape. To think I almost encouraged a connection with a married man. How fortunate that this person arrived before things progressed further." Ashley said nothing, staring out the carriage window at the passing street lamps that blurred through her unshed tears. "It's a disappointment, of course," the Countess continued, oblivious to her stepdaughter's distress. "But there will be other suitors. Perhaps not dukes, but respectable gentlemen nonetheless." Ashley closed her eyes, unable to bear her stepmother's practical assessment of the situation. How could she explain that what had been lost tonight was not a potential advantageous match, but something far more precious? She had given Jorge her trust, had shared her thoughts and dreams with him as she had with no other person, and he had repaid that trust with the cruelest kind of deception. Upon returning home, Ashley went directly to her chamber, ignoring her stepmother's continued practical assessment of their fortunate escape. Once alone, she removed the pearl pins from her hair, placing them carefully in their velvet box. Then she gathered every letter Jorge had sent her, every note passed in secret, and moved to the fireplace. One by one, she fed them to the flames, watching as his words she had treasured, curled and blackened and turned to ash. Only when the last letter was gone did she finally allow herself to weep, mourning not just the man she had thought she knew, but the woman she had briefly been allowed to become in his company, valued, understood, free. What she could not know was that across London, in the ducal mansion that had once seemed so full of possibility, Jorge was facing a confrontation that would reveal truths even more shocking than those already exposed that evening. Ravenshire House echoed with the sound of shattering glass as Isabella hurled a crystal decanter against the wall of Jorge's study. The servants had been dismissed for the night, leaving the Duke and his unexpected visitor in privacy that he now regretted arranging. "Enough," Jorge said, his voice dangerously controlled. "You've made your point and thoroughly humiliated both of us in public. Now explain why you're in England claiming to be my wife." Isabella laughed, the sound holding no humor. "Claiming? Mi querido, I am your wife. The papers were all properly filed. The priest was most accommodating, especially after your uncle's generous donation to his parish." Jorge paced the length of the room, struggling to maintain his composure. "My uncle arranged a proxy marriage without my knowledge or consent while I lay unconscious and near death in a field hospital. That hardly constitutes a legitimate union." The Spanish courts disagree, as does the Catholic Church, Isabella countered smoothly, helping herself to another glass of brandy from a different decanter. More importantly, your uncle's will is quite clear. Your inheritance of the Spanish properties depends entirely on the fulfillment of the marriage contract he arranged. Jorge stopped his pacing to face her directly. I don't want the Spanish properties. I never have. They rightfully belong to your family anyway. Isabella's beautiful face hardened. They were mine until your grandfather cheated my grandfather at cards. They should have remained in the Navarro family for generations. Then take them, Jorge offered, spreading his hands in a gesture of surrender. I'll sign whatever documents you need. Just stop this charade. She moved toward him, her dark eyes calculating. It's not that simple anymore, Jorge. I need a position in society, a name that opens doors. The war has left the Navarro fortunes depleted. The properties alone are not enough. So this is about money, Jorge concluded flatly. How much do you want to disappear from my life? Isabella's laugh was bitter, always so direct, so honorable. It's charming in its naivety. The anger in her voice was real now, cutting through the affected charm she had displayed earlier. Did you think I would simply fade away while you courted your insipid English rose, after what your family took from mine? Leave Lady Ashley out of this, Jorge warned, a dangerous edge entering his voice. She has no part in our dispute. Oh, but she does now, Isabella countered with cruel satisfaction. The ton is abuzz with the scandal of the married duke pursuing an innocent young lady. Her reputation will be quite thoroughly compromised by morning. Jorge felt cold fury build within him. Whatever grievance you have with me or my family, Lady Ashley is innocent. She knew nothing of this arrangement. Did she not? Isabella raised a perfectly arched eyebrow. How interesting. So you've been less than honest with her as well. The accusation struck home with painful accuracy. Jorge had indeed kept the truth from Ashley, not just about Isabella, but about many aspects of his time in Spain. He had justified the omissions as necessary, telling himself he was protecting her from complications she needn't face until he had resolved them. Now he recognized the self-serving nature of those justifications. He had kept silent because he feared losing her, feared seeing the warmth in her eyes turn to coldness once she knew the full truth. What do you want, Isabella? Jorge asked again, weariness creeping into his voice. State your terms clearly. Isabella's expression shifted, the calculation in her eyes momentarily replaced by something more genuine. Perhaps even pain. I want what was promised to me. A position as your Duchess, access to your fortune, and the return of my family's ancestral lands. And in return, I will be a proper wife in public. She shrugged elegantly. What you do in private is your own affair, so long as you are discreet. It is a better arrangement than most of your peers enjoy. Jorge stared at her, this beautiful woman who represented everything he had tried to leave behind in Spain. The political machinations, the calculated alliances, the marriages of convenience that had nothing to do with affection or compatibility. And if I refuse? Isabella's smile was cold. Then I shall create such a scandal that your perfect English society will never recover. I will drag your family name through every court in Europe, revealing how the noble Duke of Ravenshire abandoned his wife and responsibilities. Her voice hardened. And I will ensure that your Lady Ashley becomes collateral damage in the process. The threat hung in the air between them, its implications clear. Jorge had no doubt that Isabella would carry through with it. Her family's fall from grace had left her with little to lose and a lifetime of resentment to fuel her actions. You'll stay here tonight, he said finally, in the guest wing. Tomorrow we will discuss this further, when we've both had time to consider our positions. Isabella inclined her head in mock graciousness. As you wish, husband. After she had been escorted to a guest chamber by the housekeeper, summoned back for this specific purpose, Jorge remained in his study, staring into the fire as he contemplated the disaster his life had become in the space of a single evening. His thoughts turned inevitably to Ashley, to the look of betrayal in her eyes when Isabella had announced herself, to the rigid control with which she had maintained her dignity in the face of public humiliation. He had never intended to hurt her. Indeed, he had begun to hope, over these weeks of correspondence and conversation, that she might be the one person who could help him reclaim the parts of himself that had been lost in war and duty. Now that hope lay in ruins, destroyed by his own failure to be honest with her from the beginning, Jorge moved to his desk and withdrew a sheet of paper. He had to try to explain, even if she would never forgive him. He owed her that much, at least. As he began to write, the door to his study opened without a preliminary knock. Jorge looked up, expecting to see Isabella returning to continue their argument. Instead, he found himself facing his cousin, Lord Michael Blackwood. "I came as soon as I heard," Michael said without preamble, closing the door firmly behind him. "Is it true? Has the Spanish hellcat actually followed you to London?" Jorge set down his pen with a sigh. "News travels fast. Scandal always does," Michael countered, helping himself to a glass of the remaining brandy. "So it is true, then?" Jorge nodded grimly. "She arrived at Lady Danbury's ball this evening, introducing herself as the Countess of Ravenshire to half the ton before I could intercept her." Michael whistled low. "Bold move. I assume Lady Ashley was present?" The mention of her name sent a fresh wave of pain through Jorge's chest. "Yes. Damn," Michael muttered, dropping into a chair across from the desk. "I liked her, you know. Proper spine on that girl, not like the usual simpering misses. She deserved better than to be caught in the middle of this mess." Jorge couldn't disagree. "I never meant for any of this to touch her." "Intentions matter little in the face of consequences," his cousin replied with uncharacteristic gravity. "What will you do now?" Jorge ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration he would never permit himself in public. "Isabella wants recognition as my wife, access to my fortune, and the return of her family's lands in Spain. And in return, public harmony and private freedom, apparently." Michael snorted. "How generous. And if you refuse? She'll create a scandal that will damage not only me, but Ashley as well." A heavy silence fell between the two men, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the grate. Jorge had known his cousin long enough to recognize that Michael was considering the problem from all angles, just as he had done when they were boys solving puzzles together. "There might be a way out of this," Michael said finally, his voice thoughtful. "Uncle Henry's arrangement was made under Spanish law, yes?" Jorge nodded. "According to Isabella, all the papers were properly filed. But you're an English duke, subject to English law. Has the marriage been registered here?" "No. I've never acknowledged it. Until tonight, I wasn't even certain it had actually occurred. My memories of that time are fragmented at best." Michael leaned forward, his expression intent. "Then there may be legal grounds to contest its validity. English law might not recognize a proxy marriage performed without the groom's explicit consent, especially if you were incapacitated at the time." Hope flickered briefly in Jorge's chest, only to be extinguished by the practical realities of their situation. "Even if I could legally extricate myself, the damage to Ashley's reputation is already done. By morning, every drawing room in London will be discussing how the Duke of Ravenshire deceived an innocent young lady while already married." Michael's expression grew serious. "You care for her deeply, don't you? This isn't just another society flirtation." Jorge met his cousin's eyes directly. "I've shared more of myself with her in a few weeks of letters than I have with anyone since returning from Spain. She sees me, Michael. Not the title, not the fortune, not the war hero. Me." Michael nodded slowly, understanding the significance of this admission. "Then the question becomes not what is legally possible, but what will protect Lady Ashley while also securing your own freedom." Jorge turned back to the half-written letter on his desk. "I need to explain to her first. She deserves to know the truth, all of it, even if she never speaks to me again afterward." Michael rose, placing a hand on his cousin's shoulder in a rare gesture of affection. "I'll look into the legal options." "But Jorge, if you truly care for Lady Ashley, consider carefully what explanation will help her most. Sometimes the whole truth serves only to ease the teller's conscience, not heal the listener's heart. After Michael departed, Jorge returned to his letter, painfully aware of the wisdom in his cousin's parting advice. What could he say to Ashley that would explain his deception without sounding like self-serving justification? How could he convey the depth of his regret without appearing to ask for forgiveness he did not deserve? In the end, he wrote simply and directly, explaining the circumstances of the proxy marriage, his belief that it had never been legally finalized, and his error in not telling her of the situation from the beginning. He made no excuses, offered no defense, merely the truth as plainly as he could state it. He concluded with words that came from the deepest part of his heart. "I have been many things in my life, Ashley, soldier, diplomat, duke. But never before have I been simply myself with another person until these weeks with you. Whatever comes of this tangled situation, please know that every word I wrote to you, every conversation we shared, was genuine. The man you came to know through those letters is who I truly am, beneath the titles and the duties. I ask not for forgiveness, which I have no right to expect, but only for understanding that my feelings for you are real, even if the circumstances of our acquaintance were built upon an omission I deeply regret. Yours, in truth, at last, Jorge." He sealed the letter and set it aside to be delivered at first light, knowing it might well be the last communication Ashley would ever accept from him. The thought brought a physical pain to his chest, a hollowness he had not felt since watching his closest friends fall in battle. In the guest wing, Isabella slept soundly, confident in her position and the leverage she held. In Whitford House across town, Ashley lay awake, tears dried to salt on her cheeks. And in his study, Jorge faced the longest night of his life, confronting the consequences of choices made and truths concealed. None of them could know that by morning, an unexpected development would change everything yet again. Ashley sat alone in the breakfast room of Whitford House, pushing eggs around her plate with little interest in actually consuming them. She had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of Jorge's face as Isabella had claimed him, of the whispers that had rippled through the ballroom, of her own humiliation reflected in dozens of pitying eyes. The morning papers lay unopened beside her plate. She knew what they would contain. Lady Whistledown and her ilk would have worked through the night to ensure that every detail of the previous evening's scandal made it to print. Her name would be mentioned, perhaps not directly, but with enough specificity that no one would doubt her identity. The quiet spinster who had briefly captured a duke's attention, only to discover he was already married. How the gossips would savor that particular morsel of scandal. Ashley set down her fork, abandoning the pretense of appetite. The house was blissfully quiet, her stepmother having chosen to breakfast in her room while formulating a strategy to manage the social fallout. For once, Ashley was grateful for the reprieve from the Countess's practical assessments. The butler appeared in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "A letter for you, my lady. The messenger was most insistent it be delivered directly to your hands." Ashley's heart leapt traitorously at the sight of the familiar ducal seal on the folded paper. For a moment, she considered refusing it, sending it back unopened as a clear message that no explanation could suffice. But beneath her hurt lay a need to understand, to know why the man who had seemed to see and value her as no one else ever had could have deceived her so fundamentally. "Thank you, Parker." She accepted the letter, waiting until the butler had withdrawn before breaking the seal. Jorge's handwriting, now as familiar to her as her own, filled the single sheet. Ashley read his explanation once, then again, emotions warring within her as she absorbed his account of the proxy marriage, his belief in its invalidity, his regret at not telling her from the beginning. It was, in many ways, the worst possible explanation. Had he knowingly deceived her, she could have hated him cleanly and completely. Had the marriage been a complete fabrication on Isabella's part, she could have pitied him as a victim of slander. But this complicated tangle of half-truths and omissions left her uncertain how to feel. Anger still burned beneath her breastbone, yet it was tempered by the recognition that his situation was genuinely complex, his failure one of judgment rather than deliberate cruelty. And then there were his final words: "I ask not for forgiveness, which I have no right to expect, but only for understanding that my feelings for you are real." Ashley pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to sort through the confusion of her thoughts. Did she believe him? Did it matter if she did? The scandal was already in motion, her reputation already compromised by association. The sound of the front door knocker interrupted her thoughts. Voices murmured in the entrance hall, one of them rising in obvious agitation, her stepmother having emerged from her chamber at the prospect of visitors. "Ashley, come at once." The Countess appeared in the breakfast room doorway, her face a strange mixture of alarm and calculation. "The Duke of Ravenshire's cousin, Lord Michael Blackwood, is asking to speak with you on a matter of urgency." Ashley quickly tucked Jorge's letter into her pocket, rising with as much dignity as she could muster. "I see no reason to receive him, stepmother. The family has caused enough disruption already." The Countess's expression hardened. "Don't be foolish, girl. Whatever his purpose in calling, we would be wise to hear it. The connection might still be salvaged in some form." Ashley stared at her stepmother in disbelief. "After last night, you still think there's some advantage to be gained?" "There is always advantage to be found for those clever enough to see it," the Countess replied cryptically. "Now come, it would be rude to keep him waiting." With reluctance, Ashley followed her stepmother to the morning room, where Lord Michael Blackwood stood by the window, his expression grave. He was a handsome man in his early 30s, with the same dark hair as his cousin, but with eyes of clear blue rather than stormy gray. "Lady Whitford, Lady Ashley," he bowed formally to both women. "Thank you for receiving me at such an early hour." "We are, of course, always pleased to welcome you, Lord Michael," the Countess replied with practiced graciousness. "Though I must say, after the events of last evening, your cousin might have done better to call himself." Michael's expression remained diplomatic. "The Duke sends his deepest regrets for the distress caused. It is, in fact, on his behalf that I come with information of the utmost importance and urgency." He turned to Ashley, his gaze direct. "Lady Ashley, I believe my cousin has written to explain something of the situation regarding Doña Isabella Navarro?" Ashley nodded stiffly. "I received his letter this morning." "Then you are aware of the circumstances surrounding their alleged marriage during his time in Spain?" the Countess interjected sharply. "Alleged?" The woman presented herself quite clearly as the Countess of Ravenshire. Michael held up a hand. "If I may explain. Early this morning, I consulted with the family solicitors regarding the legal standing of this supposed union. What we discovered was unexpected." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document. "This arrived from Spain 6 weeks ago, addressed to the Duke. Unfortunately, due to a mishap with his correspondence, he never received it." Ashley found her voice at last. "What is it?" "Proof that no valid marriage ever existed between the Duke and Doña Isabella," Michael replied, his voice gaining intensity. "The priest who supposedly performed the proxy ceremony has signed a statement confessing that no such ceremony ever took place. The documents were forged at the instruction of our uncle, who had extensive gambling debts to the Navarro family." The Countess gasped audibly. "You mean the Duke is not married? Never has been?" "Exactly so," Michael confirmed. "Isabella Navarro has been perpetrating a fraud, hoping to force Jorge into a real marriage or a substantial financial settlement by threatening scandal." Ashley sank into a chair, her mind racing to process this new information. Jorge had been deceived, just as she had been. The betrayal she had felt so keenly had been built on a foundation of lies, not of his making. "But the scandal," she said softly. "The damage is already done. Half of London believes he is married." Michael's expression grew more animated. "That is precisely why I've come so early. Jorge, the Duke, wishes to address the situation immediately before the rumors become firmly established. He proposes to make a public statement at the Bridgerton ball this evening, exposing Isabella's fraud and clearing both his name and yours, Lady Ashley." The Countess was practically vibrating with renewed calculation. And what else does the Duke propose? Her meaningful glance toward Ashley left no doubt as to her meaning. Michael hesitated, glancing at Ashley with an expression that suggested he was weighing his next words carefully. I believe that is a conversation the Duke wishes to have with Lady Ashley privately, if she is willing to receive him. The Countess opened her mouth to interject, but Ashley spoke first, her voice steadier than she felt. I will see him. But not here, not under my stepmother's watchful eye. Please tell the Duke I will meet him at the library of the British Museum at 2:00. I often read there on Thursday afternoons. It was a calculated choice, public enough to be proper, yet quiet enough for genuine conversation, and free from the gossips who would be watching both their houses. Michael nodded, understanding evident in his eyes. I will convey your message. After he departed, the Countess turned to Ashley with undisguised excitement. This changes everything. If the Duke makes a public statement exonerating you and then declares his intentions— I don't know what his intentions are, stepmother, Ashley interrupted firmly, and neither do you. Don't be naive, girl, the Countess scoffed. A man doesn't send his cousin on such a mission unless he has serious intentions. This could be the match we've hoped for after all. Ashley felt a flash of genuine anger. Is that all you can think of? The advantageous match? Not the fact that I was publicly humiliated, or that my feelings were trifled with? The Countess waved a dismissive hand. Feelings are a luxury, Ashley. Security is a necessity. If the Duke offers marriage, you will accept regardless of your delicate sensibilities. And if I refuse? The Countess's expression hardened. Then you are an ungrateful, foolish girl who cares nothing for her family's welfare. Your sister's futures depend on the connections you make. Would you sacrifice their prospects for the sake of wounded pride? It was the same guilt that had constrained Ashley for years. Her responsibility to her half-sisters, her obligation to the family that had supported her after her father's death. But something had changed within her during these weeks of correspondence with Jorge. She had glimpsed a version of herself that was not defined solely by duty and obligation. I will hear what the Duke has to say, she said finally, and then I will decide what course best serves not only my family, but my own heart as well. The Countess looked as though she might argue further, but something in Ashley's expression gave her pause. Instead, she nodded curtly. See that you dress appropriately for your meeting. The blue walking dress, I think. It brings out the gold in your eyes. Left alone, Ashley returned to the breakfast room, retrieving Jorge's letter from her pocket. She read it once more, this time with new understanding. He had not known about Isabella's deception, had genuinely believed the proxy marriage had never been legally finalized. Yet he had still chosen not to tell her about the situation, to keep her in ignorance of the complications surrounding him. That decision, regardless of his intentions, had led directly to her public humiliation. Could she forgive such an omission? Did she want to? Ashley closed her eyes, remembering not the betrayal of the previous night, but the weeks of letters that had preceded it. The man who had seen value in her mind when others saw only a quiet spinster. The man who had shared his thoughts, his fears, his hopes with her in a way she suspected he had done with no one else. By 2:00, she would need to decide whether that man, the Jorge she had come to know through his letters, was real enough, true enough, to outweigh the pain his silence had caused her. And if he was, what then? What future could possibly emerge from the ashes of such a public scandal? Epilogue. The reading room of the British Museum maintained its usual hushed atmosphere. Scholars bent over ancient texts and rare manuscripts with the reverent attention of devotees at worship. In a quiet alcove near the back, partially sheltered by towering bookshelves, Ashley sat with an open volume before her, though her eyes had not registered a single word on the page. She had arrived early, needing the time to compose herself, to prepare for whatever Jorge might say. Her blue walking dress, chosen as her stepmother had suggested, made her feel strangely armored for the conversation to come. The quiet murmur of the reading room shifted subtly, a ripple of awareness passing through the scholars as a tall figure in formal attire entered the space. Jorge moved with purpose toward her alcove, his expression grave, yet somehow lighter than it had been at Lady Danbury's ball, as if a burden had been partially lifted from his shoulders. He stopped a respectful distance from her table, bowing formally. "Lady Ashley, thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Ashley closed her book, gesturing to the chair opposite her own. "Your cousin's news was unexpected, Your Grace." Jorge took the seat, his eyes never leaving her face. "I received your note about meeting here. It was cleverly chosen." "I often come here to read," Ashley replied. "It's one of the few places my stepmother considers respectable enough for me to visit unchaperoned, yet quiet enough that I can actually think my own thoughts." A ghost of a smile touched Jorge's lips, always finding the small freedoms within the constraints. The observation, so accurate and yet so gently stated, disarmed her slightly. It would be easier to maintain her anger if he were defensive or dismissive. "Is it true?" she asked directly. "About Isabella? About the forged marriage documents?" Jorge nodded, his expression solemn. "Every word." The priest confessed to the deception in writing, motivated by a crisis of conscience as his health failed. Isabella arrived in London unaware that her fraud had been discovered. "And now?" "She departed for Dover this morning," Jorge replied, "with a generous settlement to ensure she troubles neither of us again, and a promise that the Navarro lands in Spain will be returned to her family's control." Ashley studied his face, noting the shadows beneath his eyes, the tension still visible in the set of his shoulders. "You look as though you haven't slept." "I haven't," he admitted. "Not since the moment I saw your face at Lady Danbury's ball and realized what my silence had cost you." The directness of his response caught her off guard. She had expected him to defend himself, to minimize the harm his omission had caused. Instead, he offered only acknowledgement of her pain. "Your cousin mentioned a public statement at the Bridgerton ball this evening," she said, changing course slightly. "Yes." Jorge's voice grew more formal. "I intend to announce that Isabella Navarro's claims were entirely fraudulent, that no marriage ever existed between us, and that any suggestion of impropriety between us is both false and injurious to your reputation." Ashley nodded slowly, considering the implications. "And that will be sufficient? To quiet the gossips?" "It will be a beginning," Jorge replied honestly. "The ton loves a scandal, but they love redemption almost as much, particularly when it involves a war hero and," his voice softened, "a lady of unimpeachable character who was wronged through no fault of her own." There was something in his tone, a note of deeper meaning beneath the practical assessment of society's reaction. Ashley felt her heart quicken, despite her determination to remain unmoved. "Why didn't you tell me?" The question emerged more vulnerable than she had intended. "In all our letters, all our conversations. You shared so much of yourself, yet concealed this." Jorge was quiet for a long moment, his gaze dropping to his hands resting on the table between them. "When we first met, I had no intention of pursuing any relationship beyond that single dance. You were simply a young woman who caught my attention by being genuine in a room full of artifice." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "But then we began to correspond, and I found in your letters something I had thought lost to me forever. A connection that went beyond titles and expectations, beyond the careful performances we all maintain in society." "And still you said nothing," Ashley pressed, needing to understand. "Because I was a coward," Jorge admitted bluntly. "I feared that if I told you about Isabella's claims, about the legal entanglement I believed I was still navigating, you would withdraw from our correspondence, that the woman who had become the brightest part of my existence would disappear from my life." The raw honesty in his voice struck Ashley deeply. This was not the practiced charm of a society gentleman, but the painful truth of a man who had discovered his own failing. "I would have understood," she said softly, "had you trusted me with the truth." "I know that now," Jorge replied, regret evident in his voice. "I underestimated you, which is ironic, considering that your strength of character is what drew me to you in the first place." A silence fell between them, not uncomfortable, but heavy with unspoken possibilities. Around them, the reading room continued its quiet activity, scholars moving between shelves, pages turning, pens scratching against paper, a world continuing its normal rhythms while their own seemed suspended in uncertainty. Finally, Jorge spoke again, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I have not come only to explain or apologize, Ashley, though I owe you both explanation and apology in abundance." He reached slowly across the table, his hand stopping just short of touching hers, offering rather than presuming. "In our letters, we shared thoughts and dreams I have never expressed to another living soul. You know me better than anyone in London, perhaps better than I know myself." Ashley felt tears threatening at the corners of her eyes, blinking them back with determination. "What are you saying, Jorge?" "I'm saying that I love you." The words emerged simply, directly, without flourish or elaborate declaration. "Not for your family connections or your beauty, though you are indeed beautiful. I love you for your mind, your courage, your quiet determination to find freedom within constraint." He drew a deep breath, continuing before she could respond. "I know I have no right to ask anything of you after the pain my silence has caused. But if you could find it in your heart to forgive me, to give me the chance to prove myself worthy of your trust again, I would spend the rest of my life ensuring you never regret it." Ashley sat perfectly still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he must hear it across the table. She had imagined this conversation 100 different ways since receiving his letter that morning, had prepared responses for any number of scenarios, but she had not prepared for this, for the unvarnished truth of his feelings, for the absence of any attempt to minimize his mistake or pressure her decision. "You speak of love," she said finally, her voice steadier than she felt. "But love without trust is like a house built on sand." Jorge nodded, accepting the rebuke without defense. "You're right. I betrayed your trust, and no declaration of feeling can erase that fact." He hesitated, then continued with renewed purpose. "But trust, once broken, can be rebuilt. Not quickly, not easily, but through consistent truth and transparency. I ask not for immediate restoration of what we had, but for the opportunity to begin again, with complete honesty between us." Ashley looked at him, really looked at him, seeing beyond the handsome features and ducal title to the man beneath. The man who had written to her of poetry and philosophy, who had valued her thoughts when others dismissed them, who had seen something in her that even she had forgotten was there. The man who had made a grievous error of judgment, yet faced it directly, without excuse or evasion. "What would rebuilding trust look like?" she asked, her voice softening slightly. Jorge seemed to gain courage from her question, from the implicit possibility it contained. "It would begin with public exoneration of your name this evening. It would continue with proper courtship, conducted openly and with your stepmother's knowledge." A small smile touched Ashley's lips at the mention of her stepmother, who would undoubtedly be ecstatic at this turn of events regardless of the preceding scandal. "And then?" she pressed. Jorge's gaze remained steady on hers. "And then, if you find over time that I am worthy of your trust again, that the feelings we shared through our letters can withstand the light of day and the scrutiny of society, I would ask for your hand, properly and publicly." Ashley felt something shift within her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of it. The wound his deception had caused was still raw, yet she could not deny the truth of the connection they had formed through their correspondence. "I cannot promise you anything, Jorge," she said honestly. "The trust we had must be rebuilt, as you said. But," she extended her hand, allowing it to rest lightly upon his where it lay on the table, "I am willing to begin again, to see if what we found in our letters can survive in the real world, with all its complications and imperfections." The smile that transformed Jorge's face was worth every moment of uncertainty she had endured. He turned his hand beneath hers, their palms meeting in a gesture both proper enough for their public setting and intimate in its silent promise. "Thank you, Ashley." He spoke her name without title, the same way he had done in his letters, with a warmth that reminded her of all they had shared. "I will be worthy of this second chance." As they sat together in the quiet alcove of the reading room, hands lightly joined across a table of ancient knowledge, Ashley felt something unfurl within her that she had almost forgotten how to recognize. Hope. Not the desperate hope of a wallflower wishing for a dance, nor the calculated hope of her stepmother angling for an advantageous match, but the honest hope of a woman who had glimpsed the possibility of being truly seen, truly known, truly valued for exactly who she was. The scandal that had seemed so devastating the night before now appeared as merely a chapter in a story still being written. A story of two people finding each other despite society's constraints and their own mistakes. Whether that story would end in marriage remained to be seen. But as Jorge's fingers curled gently around hers in the quiet sanctuary of the library, Ashley knew with certainty that whatever came next, she would face it on her own terms, with her heart and mind fully engaged. And that, perhaps, was the greatest gift his letters had given her. Not the promise of a duke's hand in marriage, but the rediscovery of her own worth, independent of society's narrow definition of value. For a woman in Regency London, there could be no greater freedom. This tale reminds us that true love isn't found in perfect people, but in seeing and accepting each other's flaws and choices. Like Ashley and Jorge, we all deserve to be valued for our authentic selves, not just the roles society expects us to play. If you enjoyed this story of love, trust, and second chances, please subscribe to my channel for more romantic tales that warm the heart and lift the spirit. Don't forget to like and comment below. I'd love to hear which character resonated with you most.